Good morning, everybody, and welcome very much on behalf of CGD, Data 2X, and IDRC. Welcome to this exciting meeting. And my name is Maida Bubinic, and I do half here and half at Data 2X. So this is the perfect meeting for me. I don't have to split myself. So let me just tell you a bit of there's a story behind this meeting. Actually, there's a history behind this meeting that I want to just briefly tell you about. It all started with the work that we had been doing at the United Nations Foundation with the ExxonMobil Foundation, where we published a roadmap as to how to empower women economically. And then we did an update of that roadmap. And the foundation, immediately after doing this said, well, but how do we measure women's economic empowerment? So we did measurement papers. And, last year, we sort of upped and did another set of measurement papers. And we had a meeting. And we had a meeting here. And this meeting really is sort of the follow-up to that meeting last year. Through the measurement papers, and you can get them all, they are in two websites, in the Data 2X website, and they're also in the Women Economic Roadmap, womeneconroadmap.org website. In the measurement papers, it was quite clear that economic advancement for women and economic empowerment for women, while they often go together, sometimes they do not. And two examples, I think, one where economic empowerment happens, but economic advancement does not, is an example that Chris Woodruff, that is one of the people who wrote one of the papers, says, and this is, for instance, the case of a factory workers who have been working in the factory, and suddenly there's a child care center that's put inside the factory, and this reduces stress, and women feel more empowered, but obviously their earnings have not increased. So you can have economic empowerment without economic advancement. The reverse is also true and probably happens even more often. And I see Linda Scott there, who has written about this. I think in the Walmart case, women increase their incomes, they earn, but then men take control over their earnings. So if you just measure the objective income measure, you see that in fact, they are doing better, but they're not empowered. Actually, they are disempowered because men are now controlling the income. So clearly, we have to measure both. And clearly, measuring empowerment is not easy. There is, however, rich conceptual work on what is empowerment and how to measure it. And I'm delighted that we have Naila Kabir here, who, her and Amartya Sen, I think, have done sort of most of the more important conceptual work. But up to very recently, there was little empirical evidence. And there was a big disconnect, I think, between the rich conceptual work and very little empirical work. But this is what I think is changing now. And this is the good news. And researchers are addressing the disconnect. And that's what we're here today. So I am delighted to introduce Susana Martinez Restrepo. She is a researcher at FEDesarrollo, and she's also co-founder of Core Woman. And Susana is one of the people who presented last year, but now she has a book. So, between last year and this year, she has been very, very busy, and she wrote this book, and so she will present. And commenting will be Sonia Laszlo, who is the director of the Institute for the Study of International Development at McGill University. So I leave you with both of them, and I hope that this will be a really fascinating meeting. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. Do I have a microphone? Ah, it's here. Yes, okay. So last year, I was here presenting some of the early ideas that we had for this book. And part of actually of this book was result from a short think piece that we wrote for this project by Center for Global Development and UN Foundation. And I wanted to start telling you about the motivation for this book. Do I go? Okay. So in 2013, I was a young researcher back in Colombia after my PhD. I had finished in 2012. It was my first big project measuring women's economic empowerment, measuring all the literature, discovering NILA. And I went to the field work for 3 weeks, which I never did again, and it's very rare that I have the time to do it again. And actually, I am in the corner interviewing. And after all these conceptual framework and all these papers, I realized that some of the things that I was trying to measure were not really working. And I'm still very young, but I was very young out of the PhD. I'm like, why is this not working? Why we don't know about the problems that we find in the field? And this, for example, is in Cali, the picture in the left. This is my hometown. This is a very actually dangerous area of Cali, and this is in Angostura, Antioquia, in Colombia, in rural areas. And I started finding problems measuring some of the subjective measures that we had, and I'm going to speak about that later. Also, I understood that for some women, working was disempowering, and that for me was shocking to hear that from their perspective. I remember, for example, this group was particularly difficult, and that's why I put the picture. I remember that she was telling us that she was victim of domestic abuse. She left her husband, so he said, yeah, I am empowered, I left him. And she had 3 teenagers. And when she left her home to work outside the home, because of course child support in informal economies is not an option, 2 of her 3 kids were killed in gang violence in Siloé in Cali. And she was crying and crying, and she was saying, I should have allowed my ex-husband to beat me up because my kids will be alive. And we were so shocked, and we had actually photographers, and they were male, and they were feeling bad about what they were saying. And for example, I remember she had an 8-year-old, and she was telling us that she would prefer to work from home, even if that meant making less income, because her 8-year-old was raped by her stepfather. So she really needed to be home. She needed to take care of her. And if that meant not making as much money, she would prefer that option than to leave her child unsupervised. So listening to these 90 stories and the problems that we have measuring some of the subjective measures that I'm going to go later, I said, but we need to discuss beyond writing a paper, and I wrote 2 papers from this project, but beyond writing a papers as researchers, we also have to say what the challenges that we have and why it's not working, because there's a publication bias, and we shouldn't be telling, when we write, we shouldn't be saying all the problems that we have. We try to look nice and see and show the coefficients. And so I got together with some other researchers in a conference, and I told them, look, this is what's happening to me. And they were like, yeah, that's also my case in Peru. That's also my case in Uruguay. That's also my case. And every time I spoke with people, this wasn't like I didn't invent the wheel. I was just being rebellious enough to point it out and to discuss it, but they were all seeing those things in the field. So I said, you know what, let's try to write together. And we came together with this book from evidence from the field, from our own challenges, and positive outcomes as well, all the things we learn and all the solutions that we're trying to give to them, to the measuring of women's economic empowerment. So our objective is to provide evidence from the field about the challenges we have faced to measure women's economic empowerment. And we have evidence from 3 countries, Colombia, Peru, and Uruguay. And we are focusing in the book in 3 areas. And I am very specific about 3 areas because when you talk about women's economic empowerment, it's so broad. we have so many measures. And because we wanted to be really from our experience and to take like fieldwork gossip, it had to be from what we are doing. So we focus in these areas, which is decision-making and subjective dimensions of well-being, which we only use freedom to choose, and there are many ways to measure subjective well-being, but this is the one we have evidence from. The other one is labor market achievement or engagement, which is chapter 6, 7, and 8 of the book, and then we propose some solutions to these problems. And our target audience is, I thought that this problem was most common, of course, Naila wouldn't do this, but among researchers from the field, young researchers, people from foundations that are starting to measure this women's economic empowerment, students, NGOs, governments doing impact evaluations, and this is talking to them and to many of you about how to deal with these situations and how to improve the way we measure. So our research questions is, first, how to effectively improve women's economic empowerment through income generation strategies, training, and social programs. Are measures of economic empowerment, such as decision-making, employment, income, good proxies for women's economic empowerment? And this is a very hard question to ask because we are using it all the time, but we are providing some critical insights about the way we're using it. What existing challenges measuring subjective dimensions, such as decision-making, power over purchases, and freedom, or of freedom of choice and status to work, and what solutions we can provide to the challenges we found. So I'm going to every chapter of the book. Chapter 2 talks about conceptualizing women's economic empowerment and as a process. And it's very interesting because Supriya just told me that we cited Naila 54 times in the book. and in this chapter is a lot about Naila. And I think it was my own learning process. I'm like, oh, let's organize this book. We have all these chapters, all this evidence. We know that something is not working, but first we need to conceptualize it, and then we need to articulate. So that's why we cite her 54 times. And in Seoul, when she came to the presentation of these in feminist economics, I felt like I was with a rock star in my panel because I was citing her so many times. So this is a lot about empowerment as a process, and this is very useful across all the books. So some people might know this work a lot, some people might not, but for those that are not familiar about this conceptualization, it's very useful to understand what the problems that we saw in the empirical part. So this is just basically saying resources as human capital, land, house, so on and so forth, are preconditions of empowerment, and not necessarily proxies, or is more a precondition, something that you would need to be able to be empowered. Then agency entails negotiations, decision-making, and is the process to define one's goal and acting upon those goals. So some of the proxies that we use in agency are decision-making. But then what decisions are really strategic is what changes the way we measure women's empowerment, and that's going to be in the following chapter, so I'm not going to talk too much about that. And well-being achievements constitute the outcomes that have transformational implications in gender equality. So if empowerment doesn't lead to well-being and to transformation in the life of women, they are not necessarily achievements of positive outcomes. And the most important is choice. So in this conceptual framework, we define the role of intersectionality, positionality, the role of scarcity in our decisions and priorities, the role of context and culture, and qualitative methods. And positionality, I think, is one of the most important, and this is my own challenge that when I remember one time I was in a focus group in this impact evaluation that gave the motivation, and I saw a woman my age at that time, like 32, and I remember she was saying, no, I don't work, I drop out of school, I have 3 kids, my husband makes $50 a month, and I'm like, oh my God, how does she do it? And then I introduced myself, and I said, I'm 32, I'm recently divorced, I don't have kids, and I have 2 cats. And she was like, oh my God, poor woman. And this is about our positionality. Like for her, I was failure in life. No children, 2 cats, alone, divorced. So this made me this made me think about a lot about asking about my own situation when I am creating these surveys. Okay, so and the role of just to finalize it, the role of context and culture is very important because some of the things I did and we do often is because in South America, the literature in women's economic empowerment is not as developed as in South Asia and somehow in Sub-Saharan Africa. That what I was doing was importing some instruments to Latin America, and then I realized that they were not necessarily working, and I'm going to talk about that. So always take into account the role of context and culture when developing instruments. So part 1 focuses about decision making, which decisions are empower women economically, which are chapters 3, 4, and 6. And chapter 3 by Johanna Yancari Cuevas, that is a researcher at the Instituto de Estudios Peruanos, talks about the evidence of the pilot savings program, which is a program that belongs to Juntos, which is a conditional cash transfer program. So she has very interesting results, and is that she found at the beginning, as a result of the program, women were super empowered, like 95% were empowered, measured as decision-making over groceries and over household decisions. And she was like, wow, this is so amazing. We were so empowered. We really achieved something with this program. But then when she came to the qualitative work, they were like, okay, so how was the process of the decision? How did it work? No, we didn't take the decision. They told us about what groceries they were going to buy or about what fridge they were going to buy. So they were like, okay, there's a problem here in the quantitative. They were saying they were taking the decisions alone or jointly, but in the qualitative, they are saying that they understand that they made the decision because their husband told them, communicated with them. So they were very skeptical about that, and this chapter shows that skepticism. It can be on the one hand that they are not asking the right questions in the quantitative and in the qualitative, or it could be that the interpretation of women differ to what we interpret, and that is what Martin is going to say in the next chapter. So in the next chapter, Martin comes with some solutions that are really, really interesting, evidence from the Women's Leadership Small and Medium Enterprises Program in Peru. He's a researcher in GRADE. And I don't know if everybody can see here, but he does something really interesting. Can I point this out? So instead of asking about whether you make a decision alone, jointly, or with other family member, he divides this in whether the woman expresses their opinion, whether she decides and acts, or whether she makes no decision at all. And in addition to that, he asked the woman what they think and what they think about their husband's perception. I would say something, I will complement with this, some ways to improve this later, but it is interesting because normally we have only one question about decision making, and here we're having 3. And actually, I would divide these. We realized this later, but it would be interesting to divide between decide and act, because I could say, oh, I'm going to sell rice. No, I'm going to sell rice, and I sold the rice. Acting is different as just deciding. So it's really interesting because it divides several options. And what is interesting also about this methodology is that he's dividing, because this was a family business, they were saying, okay, let's see whether women are making more decisions in the family business and whether men are making more decisions in the household chores decisions. Because stereotypically, we'll have women making more household chores and men dealing with the family business. So they wanted to see if it was empowering for both. Because women can, if we ask women to do all the family businesses and the home, well, it's very disempowering, which is what Mayra was suggesting before. So what's interesting is that he disaggregates all these options that you can look in the book, and he compares women's perceptions. Two things that I will do for a new pilot on this will be to divide the sites and acts, and not to only to ask about women's perception on their partners, but also to ask their partners to see how they are getting more involved in family businesses and in the household. Okay, so chapter 5, freedom to choose, is evidence from Colombia and Peru. In the case of Colombia, it was a pilot that I did the same impact evaluation. And this is the famous stairs of well-being, which in our case really didn't work. And we thought that we had to say it. So I don't know if you're familiar with this question, but basically this question asks, from 1 to 10, how much freedom do you think you have to decide over your life? How was it 10 years ago or 5 years ago, and how is today? And you show them this as a visual aid, and then they say, oh, 5 years ago I was here, and today I am here. So the funny story about my case, and I was in the fieldwork seeing the interviewer, so I saw in the book, I tell this case where a woman says about this question, so how much freedom did you have to decide? And she was like, oh, no, 5 years ago I was living with my mother-in-law. And I'm like, no, it's freedom to choose. But she wasn't understanding. and where are you now in the stairs? And she was like, now I live only with my husband. And I'm like, okay, it can be training problems. It can be many issues. It can be that we were not training correctly the interviewers. It can be that the question was badly framed. But I think that it was also a very abstract question to us, to these women. Our particular people, women in Colombia were extreme poor and moderate poor, with on average primary school and some incomplete secondary education. So these type of questions, abstract questions, were very hard to understand for them. In the case of Peru, they took on average 8 minutes to ask this question, and they had a lot of missing variables. And at the end, they realized that the interviewers were just putting the response in the mouths of the interviewer, so they decided not to go ahead. So this chapter discusses that, and it's very interesting because we have a discussion about how can we make more concrete questions about subjective measures, which is one of the points, whether we can use concrete life examples that they can reflect to, and that they can be that they can identify to, other than freedom to choose. In part 2, we discuss labor markets and economic empowerment, and the status of work. And in chapter 6, we have evidence from Red Unidos in Colombia. And actually, we found no effect whatsoever of the program on any measure that we use in terms of increasing income, entrepreneurship, labor market participation, informality. Nothing worked. In the qualitative work, we thought, okay, there are several things going on. These women are women under extreme poverty, and a lot of the constraints, structural constraints around their lives haven't changed. So even if the program is successful and well implemented, which was not the case, all these other constraints, such as access to childcare and transportation and street violence, are not changing. So the incentives are not really changing after, even if the program worked. So we discussed these findings and these structural constraints, and how for some women, according to their meanings, work can be disempowering. And we had this idea to write this paper, which I really recommend. It's really good. It's a behavioral experiment. And we said, okay, a lot of the women in the mixed method of the impact evaluation suggested that one of the reasons that they couldn't go out and work and that the program didn't have any result was as a result of constraints and social norms. And in part, they were saying that their husbands were not allowing them to work. So we said, okay, let's do an experiment and bring their husbands and their wives and make them an offer and see what happens on the decisions. And we had a control group which was their husbands present at the experiment, and the control group, which was their husbands not present at the experiment. They were all married. You can find this in the book, but the experiment basically had just different scenarios measuring these constraints as the cost of transportation, childcare, and hours worked. And we had several scenarios where we offered informal jobs and formal jobs to see whether they had a preference for a formal versus an informal. And we found that negotiating with their husbands made a difference, and that made a difference on their behavior and their preferences. And the only jobs that they were really prefer having their husbands present were part-time jobs with full benefits and high quality. So the thing is that for these kind of women that are in extreme poverty and primary education, having a formal job, part-time, and high quality is very difficult or impossible. So basically, this would explain why a lot of the women from the impact evaluation of the other program wouldn't have any effect on employment, because social norms and also the status and the quality of the jobs that they can access are not really a good incentives for economic empowerment. So in chapter 8, we complement this information with qualitative information from Uruguay. And it's really interesting because basically what she says is, okay, let's see what is the status associated to work. So what if, for some women like me, I'm a researcher, I really love what I do, work is empowering, but what if for women that don't have a choice, and this is part of the conceptual framework, that are really under really harsh conditions, that have to leave their kids unsupervised in a low quality, dangerous childcare, maybe working is not empowering. So empowerment, work is not necessarily a good proxy of economic empowerment if it doesn't come out of choice, if I don't have the choice to have different options. So this paper, this chapter talks about the role of status, and it finds that it is really different according to the economic status and the education level of women. Chapter 9, just to conclude, shows some methodological considerations in measuring women's economic empowerment in South America. And basically, what we say is that we need to rethink the methods, how we measure women's economic empowerment. We need to integrate subjective measures of employment, of status, but we also need to do it with concrete examples, and that's a lot of what we propose in the book, concrete life experiences so that they feel identified and not things in the air like I did. freedom of choice, and test and pilot more. So always wonder, this is for South America, but whatever you are, I think that Naila's work is very useful. Always wonder what's strategic, because what a strategic decision is might change according to countries, to context. So buying groceries in Latin America for women is not necessarily empowering, because we're super moms and the domain of the household is already controlled by women. It can be actually disempowering doing too much if men don't step in. And this is also the point of new masculinities, how we include women, men and women in the equation of economics empowerment. They need to do more in the household and not just empowering women so that they sleep less and do everything, right? And work with mixed methods. Participatory activity, SenseMaker is a new software that I described that allows to have stories and apply them to a real context and measure qualitative and quantitative, and we discuss that in the book, and there are references. And embrace behavioral experiments. Sometimes the situations are not real because it's a lab experiment, but it allows us to understand more behaviors. So the book is available for free PDF in this link. We will be launching in Bogota in February 8th, and we can send some hard copies to some organizations when we have the printed copy in Bogota.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real delight to be here talking to everybody about this topic, which is really profoundly interesting, both from an intellectual but also from a very personal perspective. So first of all, I'm here to talk obviously about Susanna's excellent book, but also, in the sense that we're talking about some very important lessons coming from Latin America, to also talk a little bit about some of the GROW projects that IDRC has been involved in terms of promoting women's economic empowerment, and also to try to draw the links between these. So first of all, Susanna, I really enjoyed your book. One of the things that I really appreciated with the book was the honesty with which you're writing it. And I think this came out very clearly in your discussion. And I think that the fact that we're having a conversation, a scientific conversation about how we measure things, but keeping it sort of very real with these individual stories about experiences, I think really goes to show how diverse these experiences of women around the world are. And I think that this really represents very clearly the complexities in both the concept of empowerment, how we measure it, and also the process. So thank you very much, I think, for doing a lot of justice to that complexity in your book. All right, so if I think about your book, you contribute a lot and way too much to talk about in 10 minutes, but I'd like to focus on three very core contributions of your book. So one of the main contributions here is that you're really focusing on Latin America, and we do know that a large proportion of the innovations that have traditionally happened in this literature have come from South Asia. They've come from Sub-Saharan Africa. So to really ground this in Latin America, I think is a huge service to knowledge. So thank you very much. Now, perhaps one of the reasons why we don't often hear, or as often hear, about women's economic empowerment in Latin America is, I think, especially because of this concept of the superman, the supermadres, right? Because there's, if you work in the field, you know how strong and empowered these women are. There's like, really, is there an empowerment issue? Yes, there is, actually, despite the fact that they're doing everything within the household. Not that that's not true in other settings in the world, but I think you do a very good job at highlighting that. And it also, I think this notion of the supermadres, yes, they're making a lot of decisions. So if we're thinking about these traditional measures of empowerment, decision-making, and all of that, well, they're doing this already. There are nevertheless, a number of other issues, and I think we're seeing this even more now with the current Ni Una Más campaign, that there's still a lot of issues surrounding women's empowerment, whether it's through intimate partner violence or other areas. But I think the other thing that your book really highlights is that context really matters in thinking about contextualizing this, and especially in terms of measuring it. So I'd like to now turn to this issue here of methodology. So one of the main contributions as well of your book is this focus on subjective measures. And there's a reason why this is a contribution, because this is a very difficult thing to do. It's subjective, so it's difficult. It's individual, it's about life experiences, and it may be very difficult to translate from context to context, continent to continent, and from individual to individual. And so I think this deserves a considerable amount of work, and thank you very much for laying it out so nicely. So, the issue with a lot of objective measures, outcome measures of empowerment, is that they don't necessarily get to the issues of empowerment itself. Obviously there are these difficulties in designing an instrument and in using instruments that have been used somewhere and then applying it here so that we can compare, but it's not really comparable. But I think one of the very nice things in your book is highlighting the tremendous, and I think still very untapped, potential to develop behavioral, experimental, and psychosocial measures of empowerment. Okay, and I think that this need to link quantitative and qualitative measures is really important, not just as a means to an end. Certainly, as an economist, I have a tendency a wrong tendency to rely on qualitative research to help understand my quantitative findings, but I think there needs to be a lot more of a discourse between the two, so as a means to an end, but also as an end in itself. And I think one of the things that you've also pointed out very nicely in your book is that the rewards as an academic to do so may not necessarily always be there. So maybe this is something that we need to think about in terms of rewarding researchers to combine these things. Some disciplines do it better than others, Okay, a third major contribution of your book is this notion that we really do need to rethink the focus on employment outcomes as measures of empowerment. And I mean, there's no question employment, an ability to generate income, to feel that we're contributing to society, and so on. I mean, it's very central to the notion of empowerment. There's no question. But that does not mean that the two concepts are the same. Right? Obviously, there's these issues about the quality of employment. We heard some very compelling stories about this huge tension between a work-life balance. I mean, for us in North America, the tension between work-life balance might mean you might miss your kids' soccer practices here and there if you're working a little bit more. The context that you showed in the case in Colombia, she goes to work, her kids die. I mean, those are some very strong and very compelling examples. More work may not be optimal. Certainly that's the case if we're dealing with low wage or low quality work. And of course, this is very often, these are settings where there's no such thing as a compensating wage differential, right? You're not going to get a higher wage because you're working at low quality job, right? So that's something to keep in mind. And the other thing, too, which I really enjoyed in your book, is that entrepreneurship may very well mean different things, and not all of them are empowering. And here I'm also thinking about a recent paper by Cronin Furman on the emissaries of empowerment, where the authors do talk about the fact, well, just if you train women and moms to, raise chickens and weave baskets, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be obviously more empowered, right? They may not want to raise chickens, right? That's the first question you might want to ask yourself. As a leeway to start thinking a little bit about the GROW projects that IDRC has been funding, in addition to talking about the projects in general, I'd like to just very briefly, in this context here, talk about a study that I was involved in providing subsidized childcare in one of the slums of Nairobi. Right? So we provided, it was an RCT, randomized controlled trial. We provided free subsidized childcare to decent childcare, whatever decent is in a slum of Nairobi. And what we found is that women who weren't working were 8% more likely to work with the childcare provision. Of women who were working before the intervention, we actually found that they worked fewer hours, right? Okay, and we also found that really, if we're looking at these traditional autonomy measures, not much of a difference. Okay, so how do we reconcile all this? And you were talking about the importance of childcare, and you were also talking about this in your introduction. Well, it provides a safe place to make sure that the kids are going to be safe, and this makes a huge difference to a parent, right? The other thing that we found is that, well, women were working slightly less, but they weren't working like less than 10 or part-time. They were going from 60 hours to closer to 40 hours, right? So that's a huge improvement in well-being, okay? And so these are things that might not necessarily be picked up in standard measures of empowerment, and they're really difficult to measure, right? That sense of, oh, my kid is going to be safe for 8 hours this day, right? And that's huge. All right, very briefly, I want to talk about what the GROW projects have been doing in terms of measuring women's economic empowerment. So for those of you who are not familiar with them, these are a number of projects that have been funded by Canada's International Development Research Centre. This is a partnership with UK Aid and the Hewlett Foundation. These are a number of programs, projects, 14 of them, 50 different countries. You see the map there. The idea here was to improve economic outcomes and opportunities for poor women on the themes of employment, care economy, and women's economic agency. So IDRC actually approached us at McGill saying, look, it'd be really nice if you can sort of help us disseminate the research on from GROW projects. So we've been doing that. But the other thing that came out from these conversations with IDRC is, let's see if we can actually figure out how these different projects, very diverse, you can see they're not everywhere in the world, but still very diverse places in the world. How do they go about measuring these sorts of things? All right, so some general observations. So what we did a systematic review of the 14 projects, the 32 documents that we had available at the time of writing this this document. And if there's anybody here that's on a GROW project and you haven't sent a document, please do, so we can incorporate it to our inventory. And we looked at it across 6 different domains. And what really struck out very clearly here is that there's really tremendous heterogeneity in measurement. And I think this really reflects the difficulty, the complexity in conceptualizing women's economic empowerment. We have, thank you for all the contributions, Naila, that you've done to this literature, but it's still a very complex notion, right? If it were easy, we would have done it, right? There is no such thing as a one-shoe-fits-all. Ultimately, all measures are proxies, right? It's not like we can take a ruler and, Susanna, you are, empowered by this amount, right? We can't do that. We need to, so some measures are much closer to the concepts as you and Marchesen have put it, and others are a little further. And it's very specific to different studies, different contexts, and it really depends on the available data, right? And this is really where there's a lot of tremendous room for improvement in terms of generating primary data for this, because the secondary data for this is limited, right? Very limited. And then the other thing that I think is really important to raise is that some papers are very much about women's economic empowerment, but they don't actually measure it itself, right? And I think that's something to keep in mind, is sometimes we can measure these things in ways without actually trying to measure it. So I've been given the, so I will speed up, main findings. Okay, so just bringing the lessons together between the work that Susanna put in her book and what we found with the GROW projects is that despite the recognized importance of employment for empowerment, there are many pitfalls in looking at especially labor market outcomes as proxies for women's economic empowerment. Obviously, there's your standard identification issues, reverse causality, quality of jobs, the work-life balance. Something that I do want to stress a little bit here is that we may talk about women's economic empowerment in terms of outcomes, but those outcomes are very much affected by labor market dynamics, preferences, frictions in markets that may actually have very little to do with empowerment. So that's just something to bear in mind. And then just the last slide. There are many different ways to sort of categorize these measures, and I haven't gone into this very much, but the ones that people are thinking about most commonly is the distinction between objective and subjective measures. I think we very much need to allow for flexibility to the research question, context and data availability, as shown very much in your book. And I think really the last 2 points here, that my big recommendation is to really, when measuring, really link it to the theory and link it to the concept of empowerment, right? Rather than just applying something. I think that's quite important. So with that, I'm just going to conclude with this slide saying that if you want to hear more about some of the research that the GROW authors and projects are doing, you can visit us at thegrow.research.mcgill.ca. Okay, thank you. So, how do we?
Well, we can open to questions.
Sure.
Or yeah,
that sounds good. Are there any questions from the audience? Oh, there's a question here.
Hi, I'm Patty Pettish, and I'm currently working with the International Center for Research on Maize and Wheat outside Mexico City. And I've done a lot of work in Colombia, qualitative work on women's empowerment and poverty. And I've used ladders with thousands of focus groups in my studies, but usually shorter ladders, and they're in focus groups. So it's a different process. Mm-hmm. But when you said the woman didn't understand, when she's saying, I was living with my in-law, she was trying to tell you she's probably on step 1, 2, or 3 of your 10-step ladder, but she didn't quite know how to articulate that probably. And then when she said, well, now I'm living with my husband, and I'm on step 1, 2, or 3, that's how people express their agency often, especially women. It's in relation to their household hierarchy and the local norms. And I think the more you can get a handle on these norms, the better you'll be able to interpret the kind of data you're getting.
Let's take two more, and then you can answer.
Hello, my name is Rohini Pandey, and I work at the World Bank. And I had two quick questions. This was really interesting. We're starting some work in Pakistan on this issue, so this was really interesting. Hi. One is, I didn't hear any discussion of how to try and conceptualize and measure the value of leisure as an idea of empowerment. Because there's always, women don't work because they need to do other things, right? But then if you take care of the other, where does any kind of leisure come in? Because we know you go to any developing country place and men have loads of leisure and women don't, right? But do women even recognize it? I mean, is there a concept of choice with leisure at all? Forget about empowerment. And the second issue that I'd like to hear a little more about, especially from your fieldwork, you alluded to it in the beginning, but not thereafter, is, I realized that the focus of this session is on economic empowerment, but we know that economic empowerment doesn't lead necessarily or correlate with other types of empowerment. And if you have any ideas about how to sort of, I guess, not rank, but look at economic empowerment versus other ways that women have control over their lives and women's own views on which types of control they think are most important. Because if the idea is to empower women according to how they feel they are empowered, if we focus only on how they feel they might be economically empowered, maybe actually they would prefer you to focus on another aspect of empowerment. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on these.
That's a very interesting question about leisure. So I was immediately trying to think what my own, thinking. One of the things I've come across, or in again, let's all be context specific and very much Bangladesh and sort of South Asia, is that the concept of leisure for women, I don't think exists. I think what exists is, what would I like to do with my time? What would I enjoy doing with my time? Would I like to look after the child? Would I like to be sewing a nice quilt? So I think that could be called leisure, but it may not be captured as leisure in a time allocation study. Yeah. Yeah. What would you like to do? Yes. Yes. And the other thing I wanted to say is in the book, I really found very useful that matrix by Alma Espino about how people in different socioeconomic groups translated their idea of different kinds of jobs. And the reason it's very interesting is because it tells you about the limits of aspirations. So they may all be talking about formal sector jobs, but for women from very low status or socioeconomic status, their aspiration will only go as far as cleaning in a hospital, whereas someone who is in a very high state, would have something else. And I thought that was interesting because it links to something that's coming out of our study right now, and that is when you ask women what are rank their most preferred jobs, their least preferred jobs, very often the jobs that they most prefer are not necessarily jobs that they're doing, okay? So they have a fantasy about some other kind of job, which the person who's doing that job is far more realistic about. And similarly, the worst kind of jobs will be the jobs you are most frightened of falling into, So an agricultural wage labor, her worst job is begging, because she's very likely to end up as a beggar. Whereas someone in a formal sector job, their worst idea of a job might be a factory work, you know. So it's quite interesting, this whole, you know, kind of gradation and fluidity of how people frame their preferences. And I thought it came out nicely.
We start with 3? Yeah. So yeah, the first about decision making and the stairs. We discussed in, I think it was chapter 3, exactly that, and that was a point that actually Mayra gave us when we wrote the think piece. It's like, what does it mean when you're analyzing the data and you see that these decision making, these freedom to choose stairs are having a lot of missings, and you're in the field work and you're seeing that interviewers are taking on average 8 minutes, which is a proxy of this is not working, and that they are responding different things. You're like, okay, what was the problem? On the one hand, it could be that we didn't train well the interviewers. That's always like when we deal with these kind of issues and subjective issues, we need to think about twice the amount of training, because maybe also the interviewers didn't understand what they were supposed to ask. So that's one possibility. And I think that you are really right that that is a possibility, is that she was applying a concrete example to a very abstract concept, which also strengthens our proposal that we shouldn't ask questions like that, but we should make it very concrete to their real lives, right? Mm-hmm. And that is what SenseMaker or piloting more instruments would allow us to do, like what real case scenarios we can apply so that they respond the same question in a different way. When you had to harvest tomatoes last year and there was a plague, could you decide over what to do with the tomatoes? I don't know, something like specific, not like, oh, you have freedom to choose. You know, so it's also a way to improve by making them understand really the question, which was probably the case. She was not really, for me, she wasn't really answering about freedom of choice. She was just saying that, implying that she had maybe more freedom of choice living with her husband than living with her mother-in-law. But again, it was something very concrete. So we discussed that, and that is one of the solutions that we give. Number 2, the value of leisure. We didn't talk directly about that, and specifically because this book was aimed to be very personal. So it was all our evidence, our fieldwork, our experience going there to the countryside in Colombia, Peru, and Uruguay. So there are many variables and issues that are not discussed, but because it was not included in our own research. But something about leisure and regarding time use, I did a study about time use, is that women are, in Colombia, women have less hours of leisure and less hours of sleep time. And this is also some of the critiques that we discuss in the book, that sometimes these social protection programs aiming to empower women disempower them because we want them to be perfect in every single space. And then it's like, I can only sleep 3 hours if I have to take care of the children and work and the family business and the crops and these. So that also when we suggest we need to include men in our view of women's economic empowerment, because otherwise we won't sleep. And it is, and there's evidence in Colombia that actually some of these programs could even increase domestic violence as a result, because men is like, oh, I have suddenly this woman that has money and she's, what do I do? And then, so if we include them in the process, like this is good for the family, and chores need to be distributed more equally, as we saw in the case of Peru, men have to contribute more in the household chores and women should be more included in family businesses, then we could think about redistributing time instead of making women do everything and not sleep and not have leisure time. What is most important with them, I discussed at the end a little bit an experience that I had implementing a democratic participatory activity where we had that. And it was, I don't know, that picture that I passed really fast and I don't know, with some Post-its. And we did that exercise, like let's go back and not ask them about employment, but what they mean, what they value in life. So what is the kind of woman that they admire? What is the kind of woman that they don't admire? What are the things that they value in life and how they can achieve it? And there were very interesting results. Most of women, these are women under extreme poverty in Colombia, they all talk about improving their houses. It was one of the most common: improve the roofs, put tiles, maybe have a little family business in their houses. So it was very interesting to know from their perspective what they really valued. And the last one, Naila, I don't know if you want to respond to three.
I just have one, just to touch on the leisure. Yeah, I think that's a very important issue, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, what this means, you're not going to capture it in a time use survey, because, I mean, one example that comes to mind is time with your children. We very often in these sorts of contexts try to categorize it as a chore, and certainly when we're tired and we've had a long day, you know, spending that extra hour with homework and making sure that the kid brushes their teeth and all of this might feel like a chore. But if you're more, you know, economically empowered, you're working a little less than, you're more rested, you're getting more sleep, then all of a sudden that chore becomes leisure, right? And becomes enjoyable. And I think that doesn't necessarily get captured in that way. So thanks for raising.
There are ways of capturing it in time use.
Yeah.
For instance, asking if you spend time with friends, if you spend time visiting relatives.
Sure.
We find that collective leisure is a bit more legitimized than individual leisure. So women won't sit and do nothing.
That's right.
But it's okay for them
That's
to
right.
actually go out with friends, maybe go for a movie. So asking those kind of questions does allow you to do it in time use.
Right.
Sorry, I just brought it.
Thank you. Okay, so I think that's all the time we have. So thank you very much for a great book and a great presentation. Thank you for your great feedback, and we're very much looking forward to the panel.
Thank you.
I'm Emily Corey Pryor, and I'm Executive Director of Data 2X. I feel like there were so many trigger words in that presentation. I'm also a sleep-deprived mother of 2 young children. But we're really happy to be here today, and just want to thank you all for being here, and thank Center for Global Development for hosting us, and IDRC for co-hosting with us as well. So for those of you who don't know Data 2X, we focus on increasing the quality, availability, and use of gender data. And we're here today talking about measurement of women's economic empowerment and the complexity of that measurement. And just to kick us off, and as our panelists come onto the stage, I wanted to share a brief video that Data 2X did, which is talking about how we measure women's economic participation. And I'm reflecting from all this conversation about complexity. Just want you to reflect on how complex it was to try to boil down this topic into a minute-long video. So enjoy, and panelists, if I can ask you to take your seats. Oh, sorry.
After the video.
Oh, after the video, sorry. Bad moderator.
Decisions are built on data, but we have a problem. Data can be biased. Data can be incomplete. Let's talk about how this can affect a government's economic decisions. In the case of farming, women around the world grow crops to feed their families and generate income, while also taking care of the home and everyone in it. But oftentimes, people assume women are solely focused on household chores, that they do not also work for pay. Surveys can reinforce this assumption. For example, they may not capture all the roles, paid and unpaid, that women play. Using this inaccurate data, the government may decide to invest in training for women so they can find jobs. But since these women are already too busy with unpaid activities, they don't show up to these training programs, which then leads to wasted resources. Let's say we have better, more complete gender data. The government can use this data and may find that what women actually need are more ways to support and improve their farming or their other activities, leading to a more productive, less wasteful society. Improving gender data matters because better data from everyone enables better decisions for everyone.
our illustrious panelists to the stage. I think you have some seats here. So we're very fortunate to have some really leading experts in this field, leading experts, but also leading problem solvers, I would say, in measurement and in economic empowerment. I'll start over at the far end. Naila Kabir, who is here, she was cited 54 times in a recent book that was just published.
That should be a record.
I'm going to add that here. She is Professor of Gender and Development at the London School of Economics Gender Institute, where her research addresses gender, poverty, social exclusion, and labor markets and livelihoods. We also have Supriya Garikipati, who's a reader in development studies at the University of Liverpool Management School, where she serves as co-director of the India and the World Research Center. And her research focuses on gender and poverty, including assessments of microcredit programs in India. We have next Marcus Goldstein, is the lead economist for the World Bank Africa Region Gender Innovation Lab. He leads research on issues of gender and economic activity with a focus on agriculture and small-scale enterprises. And finally, my dear colleague, Myra Buvanic, who is a senior fellow both at CGD and with Data2X. And she's previously served as Director for Gender and Development at the World Bank. And she was also founding member and president of the International Center for Research on Women. So you can tell. This is going to be an exciting panel, an interesting panel to wrangle. I will be the biggest sweetheart about trying to keep you on time, but I will keep you on time. So I'm going to start with Naila. So Naila, you have obviously a very rich body of work in this area, but your most recent work touches on the way that women's economic participation interacts with social and cultural norms. And so, our question is how research can better capture and measure these realities, and how communities can support women's roles as active citizens.
Okay, well, when we talk about culture, we're talking about how different societies, construct families, kinship, communities, and the larger society, large organizations, and what models of masculinities and femininities that they work with. So in a sense, culture can be seen as spelling out the initial conditions from which change has to take place. And it also spells out the conditions that have to be acted on and worked through for change to take place. And that is why we stress the importance of context, because each context will have different sets of initial conditions which posit different kinds of barriers and opportunities for processes of empowerment. So from that point of view, you have to begin where people are and where people are. And of course, culture doesn't, we think of it in terms of kinship and family, but those same stereotypes and masculine, norms spill over into the rest of society. And that means that we have to have, when we did this work in Ghana, Egypt, and Bangladesh, we became very aware that questions that made sense in Egypt and Bangladesh, such as sun preference, do you have sun preference, such as mobility, made no difference at all. I mean, it had no meaning in the Ghanaian context, because in Ghana, people don't have the same kinds of restrictions. Similarly, some of the Brazilians were able to ask questions about sexuality, which we thought was quite shocking. We would not dream in a country like Bangladesh to be asking those questions. So there are things that you can do with questions, which really, A, have to reflect the conditions, but B, also have to reflect a sensitivity to what can and cannot be asked. And even where you do ask the same set of questions, I think you have to nuance it for local context. So when we ask questions about mobility, we make a distinction between acceptable places in the public domain and those that are not acceptable. So it's quite acceptable for women in South Asia to go to health clinics. It's not acceptable for women in Bangladesh to go to the market or to go to the committee, rural committees and all that. So there's issues around that. And then again, in Vietnam, where women are the financial managers in the household, when I told my Vietnamese colleague that I wanted to ask questions about who manages the money, she said, don't be so silly, we all know. And I said, well, for comparative purposes, it's important to ask this, because then we can show that in Vietnam, women are the money managers. I think the other point about the cultural business is that there are two standpoints from which we can make measurements. One is the standpoint of the woman herself, what she values, a little bit about what we were talking about, what she thinks is important. And that is obviously important, and these are some of the more subjective measures. But if we think in terms of what Sen and others have said about adaptive preferences, we also know that women's aspirations and ideas of, what is possible are going to be highly limited. So we may also want a more external standpoint, which is about, measuring up against questions that we would agree are important, like rights and personhood and so on, which are, in a sense, may not be valued by the woman herself because she may not see herself in any way disadvantaged. But because we are trying to bring about social change, we may want to include those sorts of questions. And the other problem, I think, of culture, how many minutes have I got?
You've got 1 more minute.
Okay. And I find it very complicated in South Asia, is the question of status. And that is a lot of what we might measure as an indicator of empowerment is often an indicator of status. So for instance, women in India who have sons, who bring in large dowries, are more likely to be consulted in decision making, are less likely to get beaten. But not because they're more empowered, but because they're conforming much more to local gender norms. So there's that issue about, understanding the meaning of the changes that we're trying to measure. And the other, was there any other points? I think the final point was in terms of, and it goes back to Susanna's, that Espino matrix. Why I thought that was very interesting is if we think of empowerment as a process that has to play out at a pace that reflects local constraints, then the whole debate about, labor standards, labor rights is not going to make much sense to women who really want to end sexual harassment. And until unless labor standards, labor rights, and all that debate translates not just into union membership, but into the things that matter both as persons and as citizens, we have to make a distinction with that desired end and the kind of processes that it might unleash along the way. So I hope that makes sense.
Thank you. So just picking up on something Nyla just said about, empowerment being a process, and something that Susanna was bringing in earlier of talking about some of the structural factors that are also in play, right? There's an interaction among several factors. So when I turn to Supriya, I want to talk a bit about policies and how that impacts some of these processes. And you've written about the need to look beyond women's empowerment incomes and more closely at the channels that connect policies to outcomes. And so I'm hoping you can talk about how we connect surveys, how do we connect these measurement opportunities, and how can these surveys better incorporate questions on these channels between policies and outcomes?
Yeah, so there are two issues here. One is the difference between outcomes and processes, and the second is to look at the channels or the pathways that make sure that policies actually result in outcomes. So yes, indeed, it is necessary to look beyond women's outcomes and to examine the processes that lead to these outcomes. For instance, we all know that women's livelihoods are almost a fundamental step towards realization of agency. And typically, because of this, capturing whether or not women participate in the labor market is seen as a good idea to measure empowerment. But without actually examining the process of causality, it may be misleading to conclude that work is actually empowering, right? Examining the process of causality itself embeds several questions, like what sort of work is this? What are the terms and conditions of employment? Was this her choice? And so on. It would be dangerous, obviously, to conclude anything about women's work without examining these questions. So the process that leads to this work. Not all work is empowering, as some may simply reproduce structures of inequality. What we need to look for is work that challenges these structures, especially challenges the patriarchal norms surrounding women's income and time use. So that is critical. And obviously, in the same vein, there's clearly a need to closely consider channels or pathways that connects policies to outcomes. the need to ask questions of whether policies are indeed leading to beneficial outcomes for the concerned target group or not. The way to capture efficacy of pathways or channel created by policies is not to rely entirely on quantitative close-ended questionnaires, but to open up to the use of mixed methods. And I think this is especially true for the economist amongst us. So open up to mixed methods and closely examine the pathways that policies create in the wake of their implementation. Let me clarify this by using an example from my own work. One of the main objectives of India's microcredit program was to enhance livelihoods for rural women. Now, following on from this, we were examining the impact of India's microcredit program on women's livelihoods in the state of Andhra Pradesh. Through our quantitative questionnaires, we managed to establish that in over 80% of the cases, women were not using their loans in order to enhance their livelihoods. We figured that this was absolutely bad, so we knew that. But beyond the usual observations about patriarchy, we were unable to say why this was happening and what could be done. We gratefully received a grant to go back. And this time, what we did was we started examining the pathways that policies had created in order to enable the enhancement of women's livelihood. So opening up to mixed methods, we realized that the 23-page long application form that the microcredit program was using did not have a single question on loan use. So there were several questions, and in fact an entire section dedicated to repayment of loan and the consequences of not repaying the loan on time, but there was not a single question in these 23 pages that actually asked women anything about how they're going to use their loans or made any connection with their livelihoods. So obviously what we did was, looked at this and tried to understand. So there was no enabling pathway in sense. So the policy was there. I have half a minute?
Yeah.
Right, okay, very quickly wrap it up. So there was no enabling pathway that the policy had created in this instance. We were fortunate that we managed to work with the government of Andhra Pradesh and to introduce a much altered and a much more simplified version of the questionnaire, just 6 pages long, that did something very simple. It simply matched the women's skills at the individual household level with the needs of the local economy. And this actually enabled women to identify the kind of livelihoods that they could access. And this altered application form was introduced as the government's LEAP program, Livelihood Enhancement Program, and it ensured that it benefited the women who joined the program newly. So ensuring that policies create enabling pathways is the job of policymakers. But understanding how these pathways are working or indeed not working is clearly the responsibility of researchers. Thank you.
Thank you. So Marcus, moving right along, Marcus, you've done a lot of work on measurement of women's economic empowerment on various forms of measurement. But some of his one of Marcus's contributions is proposing a multidisciplinary framework for measuring women's empowerment based on 3 dimensions of agency. So first is goal setting, then self-perceived ability, and then acting on goals. And I hope I got those right. So can you tell us a bit about how existing measures of agency fall short? And how would your approach that you're proposing fill those gaps in current measurement frameworks? Solve that problem, Marcus.
Not in 4 minutes. So yeah, exactly.
We can negotiate.
No, it's okay. Because I have something I want to say later, so I'm going to save that. So let me just talk about 3 things that I think are interesting within this realm. There's a really long paper. There's like postcards in the lobby that have the URL. You can read that and it'll answer your question. It's like 80 pages. So
right. That doesn't solve
now
my
that I've
time
wasted
problem.
half a second, yeah. So look, 3 things I think are interesting. One is, I think, learning from psychology. I mean, there's this thing about economists that we're always, or me anyhow, I'll own it, that we're really excited by other disciplines because they've thought really hard about something we may never have thought about. So I think in this domain, there's these interesting ideas of locus of control and self-efficacy that are really, I think, useful for framing parts of what you were just talking about, of that framework. So locus of control, for those, and I always butcher these, but there are psychologists in the room who can correct me. Locus of control is sort of events around me are caused, are at the hands of fate, or I have some role in that, how I think about that. And then self-efficacy is I can actually do something to change the outcomes, right? And this is all perceived, but I think these are useful for starting to get a handle on this. And the psychologists have really thought about how to validate those locally, how to apply them to different domains and whether they tell us different things. So like at home, I may or may not feel like I have any control of what's going on when my kids won't brush their teeth and so on. So I think that's point one, is trying to draw on psychology, because I think it really helps us. Second thing, and here I'm getting more into the tool space where I think there's some interesting stuff, is vignettes. And Alethea, who's here, she's been on our team, she's been experimenting with vignettes. And this goes a bit to what Susanna was talking about earlier, which is sort of giving people grounded stories of abstract people who they hopefully could recognize and remotely identify with. So it's not so much the case of the individual context, but more of a local context where, Amia has this and da-da-da-da. And so who are you more like? Are you more like Amia? Are you more like Afia? Are you more like Ajwa? And you give them sort of three different people and use that to pull out some of these aspects. The third area, which I think is interesting, I'm still not sure what it's telling us, is the lab in the field work. So some people call this lab in the field, that's when they want to be taken seriously. Other people call these games. So basically the idea is there's a bunch, you go into a situation, you bring the people who are responding to the survey into a situation where they have to make a bunch of incentivized decisions. And from those decisions, you're going to infer certain behaviors of how they act elsewhere. And that's an open question, is like how much that's true. So an example would be you bring a husband and wife together and they have $10 and they have a choice of putting $5 into a pot where it gets multiplied by 1.5 and they get half of that back, or they can keep as much as they want. And from that you can start to infer something about cooperation and functioning in the household. So we've done this to measure competitiveness of boys in reaction to female empowerment, some interesting results there. And now we're doing some work in Ghana where we're doing a whole battery of these. And one thing that I think is, so there's this open question of whether it's actually measuring real life outside of this sterile environment. And I think there's some evidence that that's the case. But the second is, the more time we spend measuring things, and the deeper we go on this measurement, the more likely we are to change people's behavior. Right? I don't know about you, but when someone asks me a deep question, I'll think about it for a while, and it'll sort of change how I act. Right? And so this gets into this question of how much are we changing the actual outcome we're trying to measure when we measure it. I'll stop there.
That could go for a while, I think, that conversation.
Back to Galileo.
Yeah, exactly. No, we could go.
That's the next panel, is on Galileo. So Myra, she spoke at the top of the presentation about last year's event where we showcased research on measuring women's subjective empowerment. And so I'm hoping, and there's a paper that's actually also out front, a summary paper of that work that Myra published earlier this year. And I wanted you to speak a bit more about what those subjective measures were, but also a bit about, we heard from Susanna some of the issues with subjective measurement. And so would also be great if you could reflect a bit about what challenges researchers face in trying to measure.
Sure. In addition to Galileo. But let me first put a plug in for the paper that Marcus and his colleagues have done at the Gender Innovation Lab. It's an incredible effort to try to operationalize and quantify all these different concepts. And so it's really worth It must have been a lot of effort, and it's really worth reading. And I think it advances the field a lot. So a plug for Marcus. You know, there are sort of 4 different kinds. I mean, after reviewing all these things, you see that there's sort of 4 or 5 different ways that researchers have measured this subjective component of empowerment. And the first and the most typical, I think, thing that people have done, one of the most typical is, you know, you build an index, right? Because empowerment has so many different dimensions, whatever. So, and a perfect example of that, and I think there's been a lot of work going into it, is the Women Empowerment in Agriculture Index. But indexes are very complex, and they're very complex to interpret, and they're very complex to use. And you never know how you're weighing the different components of the indexes. So indices, I mean, it's something that I don't particularly like, and I think that the experience of the people that have been working on the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index is that they have now come up with a simplified version, but still, you know, it's complex. So anyway, so what most other researchers have done, and I think that this is almost like automatically, and sometimes it looks like almost like an afterthought, because if you're doing an experiment, you want to put as many measures as you can so that, you know, some will make a difference. They have conceptualized women's economic empowerment, subjective measures of empowerment as decision-making measures, influences over household expenditures or decisions between the husband and the wife. And I think that those, and most, I mean, if you look at the literature, those are the preferred measures. Susanna had a very good point, I think, in her book, that they're not applicable to Latin America. And I used to, many, many years ago, I used to work at the Inter-American Development Bank. And there was this very sort of, you know, smart person at the bank, was the head of the bank, Enrique Iglesias, and he's very well known. And he always used to say, you know, women are the administrators, the managers of poverty in Latin America. That means women do make the decisions over household expenditures in Latin America. The poorer you are, the more the woman's role is there, but it doesn't mean that she's empowered. So, you know, that's sort of one of but maybe then decision-making works in other regions. But, you know, we've just finished a case study of a SEWA project, a Self-Employed Women's Association project in India, the Gitanjali project. And, you know, SEWA obviously has been working with poor women for a very long time, since 1975. They have about 2 million you know, members of the SEWA Union. They conceptualize women's economic empowerment, the subjective dimension of empowerment, as full employment, decent full employment, and control over the income of that employment. And they refuse to measure decision-making over household expenditures. So maybe it's not just Latin America. And then, you know, I mean, I strongly believe, and I think that it's a point that you make in your paper, that the measures of empowerment have to correspond with the research that you're doing and the question that you're asking. So if I'm interested in economic empowerment, the first and foremost thing that I'm interested in is how that intervention or the increase in income affects what women do in employment, in their work. So I think that that is very critical. Do I have 1 more minute
30
or
seconds?
Seconds, okay. So then we come to another thing that it's probably a better measure of economic empowerment, that this is this measure of economic self-reliance, economic autonomy, And it gets, in a sense, to the locus of control being the subjective dimension of it. And I will end up with one of the papers, thought papers that were written last year was by somebody from the Population Council who was looking at adolescent girls. And one of the things that they were saying, you know, we're always looking at measures of empowerment, but we also want to understand measures of disempowerment. And they may not be the same. And in the case of girls, adolescent girls, the measure of disempowerment that they argue is the most appropriate and suitable is in fact this locus of control. Because when they are children, they still have control over certain aspects of the environment. And when they become adolescents, suddenly they are in the hands of somebody else and they lose that locus of control. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so.
Now I know why my daughter's angry.
Now we're talking about adolescent girls here on the side. Okay, team panel. We're a team here. We have about 14 minutes. I really want to make sure that we have time for questions. So 14 more minutes for the panel. So can you answer your second question, do you think, in like 2 minutes so that we have a lightning round call to action?
What's
Can
the
we
second
do it?
question?
All right. Oh, do you remember?
No.
Or is it in there? Well, we'll just see what happens, and you have 2 minutes. Okay. So just to summarize. So Nyla, what do you think that researchers should be measuring in interventions that they aren't? Basically, what are the gaps? Yeah, now
yes,
you remember.
I
Okay, go. 2 minutes.
Well, you know, as it happens, and by complete coincidence, I'm just finishing a paper which is looking at how people are evaluating interventions. Some of it for adolescent girls, as it happens. And I think, you know, we all talk about theories of change, but I think sometimes we deal with very truncated theories of change. So people don't go the whole hog. You know, they say, oh, look, she's got a job, or she's got a loan, or she's got an asset. But we need, if we're talking about empowerment, we need to take it a bit further. So I think in this paper, I've tried to develop a kind of model which asks, you know, does the intervention translate into resources? Because a lot of them fail, they don't deliver. Do the resources translate into any form of capabilities? And do those capabilities translate into practical outcomes or strategic outcomes? And I think if one follows that through, then those gaps in our understanding of the process by which an intervention comes to the ground and then claims it's made changes can either be challenged or confirmed. But a little, since I probably have a bit of a minute left, this locus of control business is quite funny. Because I've only just found out it is called locus of control, but I see Sarah Baird is over there. And I think you'll remember that right from the beginning, you know, we're developing these questionnaires for 1,000 different countries studying adolescents. And I just harped on about, you cannot exclude this one question. And that one question was the locus of control, because it worked so well when we used it in Bangladesh and so on. I was a bit of a bore about it, you know, because when they showed me the first draft, I said, where's the locus of control? It's gone. She said, no, it's there.
Great. Well, thank you. So Supriya, do you remember your second question? Do you remember that there was a second question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I do.
It was the question was about, you know, how we measure changes in women's agency separate from their outcomes. So as a result of a policy, of a given policy from an intervention.
Right. So the question essentially is, you know, why is it important to separate households level impact from female, the impact on the individual woman? I mean, if you examine early literature, there was a tendency to conflate these two. But fortunately, research now has become better at separating these issues out. And the reason why it's important to separate these issues out is obviously because of impact paradox. Paradoxically, the beneficiaries, the female beneficiaries of interventions may not benefit from these interventions, but their households might, right? And that is the impact paradox. The reason why this may happen is because women are denied co-ownership in households' productive assets, and therefore they cannot access the improvements that, for instance, their loans may make to these households' productive assets. So as long as the researcher knows not to conflate these two and to ensure that even if you are doing just a basic impact evaluation to gender sensitize your evaluation questions and not just to look at overall household measures like, has the household income changed? Has the household capacity to cope with vulnerability changed? But to ask questions that are pertinent to women, to actually examine the pathways that have benefited women from these interventions. So essentially, to gender sensitize your impact evaluation is the real clue here.
Mm-hmm. Great. Problem
2
solved.
minutes?
See, she's a problem solver. Okay, so Marcus, I know there was you reserved some time in your earlier comments to say something. So we'll see what he does with this question, but what I wanted to ask was what we're not capturing in household surveys that affect, and this we were sort of getting to this with Supriya, but that affect women's inter-household decision-making roles, and kind of noting that there's a lot of variation in regional contexts, as we heard from Susanna.
Yeah, and I think my first answer was a better answer to that than I'm going to be able to conjure up at this point. So let me talk about one thing that we are capturing that I think is useful. Let me flip it around just a bit. Okay. So I think there's a tension, as always in this world, between doing it really well in the context that you are, and then having something to say globally, right? And I think, and I'm one of the trying to do it better in the local context and saying something there. But there are lots of people like Data2X who are trying to say something globally with some statistics, and I think we need something for them. And so the plug I would make, at least in the African context, seems to be that some of these decision-making variables, and I think Myra was giving a little room to this, do maybe tell us something. And so we were in this paper that I was talking about earlier, we also look at the demographic and health surveys, which asks about decision-making over income. And who controls that decision. So if a woman has more or joint, she's either the sole or joint person to say something about the income, it seems to be correlated with a lot of things that maybe status, but maybe bargaining power. Okay, so that's part one. But part two, in a number of African countries, they actually ask the man about the same thing. And 40%, roughly, of the households don't agree about who's the decision maker over income. And here I think it's interesting because we get into the contestation and sort of maybe a bit of the process. And when we look, and so the interesting thing about that disagreement is it has a direction. So either she's pulling away power that he says she doesn't have, or vice versa. It's complicated. But let me just, it's really hard to try and categorize this. But so we compared let me just give you a concrete example. So we compared the cases where they agree that she's either the sole or joint decision maker over the income, to cases where she attributes more power to herself than her husband does when asked, okay? So these are cases where she's contesting the power clearly in the direction of pulling more towards her. And it turns out that some of the variables that predict that versus some kind of agreement are she earns more than him, she owns land, and she's working off farm, which in the African context is usually, we might expect it might come with some more bargaining power. So to me that suggests that these kind of questions which are asked at a large scale and can be added up, may be telling us something useful. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for thinking about people who are trying to say something at the global level and advocate for change for global level. Thanks for thinking about us. So lastly, Myra, so it's clear from our discussion today, and you said this in your comments as well, that empowerment doesn't always apply to every sphere of a woman's life. And so just wanted to pose the question, how do researchers take this into account, and kind of what's the way forward for that work, other than it's complicated?
First, just let me say that, what you were talking about, sort of decision making, it sounds like daily life, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It would happen in my household too. So, yeah, I think it's very important. Obviously, empowerment has very different domains. You know, you can be economically empowered, you can be socially empowered, you can be politically empowered. But the assumption has been, and I think that the research has assumed, that once you're empowered, you're a Wonder Woman. And you become empowered throughout all these different dimensions, and that's not the case. And you know, I think that we need different measures for economic empowerment, for social empowerment. We may be economically empowered. I mean, just introspection, I think, makes you realize that you can be economically empowered, and then you go into a social situation, and there are other cues, and you're not. You're different. So we need different measures, and you know, very much being a data 2X, sort of wanting to find out standardized measures that we can use cross-culturally and that we can compare it. I think that the field right now is not there, this field, and that we need to start doing very sort of context-specific measures and then start aggregating and seeing if there is one measure that applies cross-culturally, but we should not assume that decision-making over household expenses is the right measure. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we have time for a lightning round. We're gonna start Q&A at 11:45. Just so you know, that's in the schedule. Keep it on schedule. But I did want to try to get a quick response from each of you on essentially what's your call to action? What's your call to action on better systems to measure women's economic empowerment? I think you were getting to this, Myra, but I'd love to hear from all the panelists.
Well, I think I'd like to disentangle some of this conversation. So yes, we can talk about economic, social, and political empowerment. And it is true that they do not necessarily translate across boundaries. But I do feel each form of empowerment has the potential for spillover effects. You know, that they're not self-contained, but we cannot predict what those spillover effects are going to be. But secondly, and more importantly, I want to make a distinction between individual and collective empowerment. So I, as an individual, may feel very empowered at a party or, you know, at university. But really, in the long run, we're looking for that bringing together of people's, the capacities that they're able to mobilize through their own individual empowerment and use it to change life for larger groups of women. So I think that set of indicators are going to look very different from the indicators that you have. And to me, the subjective is hugely important because it is the beginning of change, but it's not the end of change.
Right. I would reiterate that point. I think research is preoccupied by the need to view empowerment as an individual woman's achievement, and also to see it as a lateral process, you know, something that happens immediately after you have an intervention. So we sort of we celebrate women's empowerment as an individual woman's achievement. And sort of if she's not able to leverage policy in order to become empowered or enhance her status, then we see this as an individual woman's failure. So we haven't really understood well enough the idea of collective bargaining. And it seems in our research, it clearly comes out that collective bargaining and individual bargaining are much more closely intertwined than has been understood. And I think the focus of future research needs to be in order to understand the platforms that women are allowed to perform to enhance their ability to collectively bargain. In the area of microcredit, we don't really understand the value of these groups. You know, how are groups allowed to collectively bargain? Collective bargaining might be enabled through different types of pathways. For instance, social mobilization is one of them, or also grassroots networks that are based in social and economic empowerment might be the pathway possible. But we need to have more research in order to understand collective bargaining.
Marcus?
So the book was super exciting to me to read. I started reading it last night and I couldn't stop. So I think my call to action would just be keep experimenting. I think we're and being honest about what's not working, which that's a lot harder. And the book was really refreshing for that. And so that, I think we're starting to see a lot of progress in different measures.
And I would say that, we have to measure both attitudes and behaviors, clearly. But ideally, attitudes are very complicated to measure and subjective. I know it. So ideally, you would want to get behavioral proxies of some of the attitudinal measures and try over time to make it simple, which is a tall order.
But aspirational. Okay, so now I want to open it up to our audience. Would love to hear from all of you. And we'll start right here in the middle. She had the first hand up. And we'll take 3 at a time. And if people could introduce yourself, but keep it to a very brief question so we have time. Thanks.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Rosemary Segero. I'm president of Segero's International Group, a profit company, and a non-profit company called Hope for Tomorrow. What women are you talking about? We have high-level women, middle-class women, and low-income women. What women are you talking about? And I focus on small and medium businesses in Africa. I come from Kenya. So looking at low-income countries, most is a problem with them is violence and conflicts. Do you think of, or when you write a book, because this is one thing that is empowers women, conflicts and violence, how can we overcome this for women to be empowered than just saying economic empowerment of women? There is so much to go with this. So what women are we talking about, and how can we stop violence against women and to be empowered?
Thank you. Right there, and then we'll go right here, and then we'll do another round. Great, thanks.
Hi, thank you for the conversation this morning. My name is Benjamin Hunt. I'm with Bridge International Academies. If you're unfamiliar, we are the largest network of community schools and partnership schools in the developing world. We run schools that educate about 100,000 students in Africa and India, and we're very proud that about 50% of those students are actually girls. But my question is, I didn't hear a whole lot of conversation about education, particularly primary age education, and how that leads to empowerment and agency down the road. One of the things that we know about our schools is that we're really good at getting short-term gains that are quantifiable, and standard deviations that are quantifiable in letter reading, sound improvement, these sorts of things. But we're really not good at communicating how our educational gains serve, particularly in this case, girls over the long term, 5, 10, 15 years later. So very curious about how your research overlaps with education, particularly in low-income communities in early grades. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then I know there was a hand over here that, yes.
So I just wanted to ask, I know a lot of people have touched on it, both earlier, Susanna, and many of the panelists, that obviously we want some uniformity in the global agenda in trying to advance women's empowerment, specifically economic empowerment. Yet we also have, on the other hand, the importance of culture and context. So I'm wondering if any of you can speak on how do we strike a balance between understanding the culture and context and taking that into account, yet also trying to not compare apples and oranges, both regionally or locally.
Great, these were excellent questions. So we'll take these first round, and then hopefully we'll have time for one more round. So the first question on what women are you talking about? And is there any?
I can answer.
Do you want to answer that? Okay.
I want to answer.
Okay.
I think originally we were talking about women in developing countries, but after reading the newspapers these days, I think that we're talking about women globally.
Yeah.
Yes.
There you go.
Okay. Nyla, you look like you wanted to.
And I was actually thinking of coming back to that, to say that all our discussions about women's empowerment have been about the global south. To me, it has come as a shock to me what we're hearing, and I'm suddenly thinking, geez, these women are not particularly empowered if they can put up with this, keep silent on this, and so on. But to go back more directly to that question, no, we did not talk about violence against women. But implicit in a lot of our work are issues about to what extent does economic empowerment, that's what I meant about the spillover effect. It isn't guaranteed, but actually having some degree of independence within the household, the exit option that you can leave sometimes does help with reducing levels of violence. And if it doesn't, then you can leave. Secondly, the self-help groups, the collective action, all of that has, although it may have been motivated around financial resources and so on, have often very purposively been designed to address, first and foremost, violence against women. You know, in South Asia, in India, a lot of the self-help groups, when they started to get organized, their first action was around alcoholism, you know, to stop the levels of alcoholism that was leading to violence. So that business about violence is so intertwined in women's lives, particularly when men are under pressure to be good breadwinners and are failing, that it's never absent from what we say. So no, I didn't mention it, but if you look at the work we do, it's never far, because it is one of the indicators that we use. To what extent do different kinds of interventions, including economic interventions, reduce intimate partner violence and mobilize the community against male violence?
Yeah, and why do we need a collective approach to do this? Because individual women rarely lack the capacity to challenge structural norms. And they even lack the capacity to acquire the ability to challenge structural norms. Structural norms can only be challenged via collectivism. And women do come together in practical ways in order to do this. I mean, call it collective feminism if you like, but it does exist in the field.
Thank you. So now I'd like to turn next to the question on education and how we didn't talk about that, but it's assumed in an early stage, you know, measurement, and I think there's probably a lot of people in the audience too who'd be happy to talk, but about this. But Nyla, you're nodding vigorously. So why don't you start, and then Marcus, if you.
Because what amazes me, and I haven't done the qualitative research to understand it, is the extent to which even second-rate education in the kinds of countries I'm talking about can make a difference. In fact, in the work that we did in India, Bangladesh, Ghana, Egypt, etc., secondary plus education performed really well on the kinds of indicators that we were measuring. But this is second-rate bad education. So I ask myself, what would it achieve if we educated boys and girls with really high-quality education? Going back to that violence question, there's a great video at the moment of young boys, little boys and girls in Kenya, girls being taught to defend themselves and boys being taught to come to the defense, you know, to stand up against violence. I don't know how much to believe it. It's just too good to be true. But if it's true, it's great.
Yeah. And Marcus, I know you've done some interesting research on the educational system and aspirations and empowerment.
So I'm with Nyla. I think on balance the effects are good, but there's a bit that we're also missing, which is the dark side of education, which is the inculcation of social norms on gender, right? So we did some work on women who break into male-dominated trades in Uganda, and if the teacher was the one who helped them figure out what job they were going to take, they were so going to be a hairdresser. Right? And so the teachers were just, and you know, and coming back to the global point, you know, my kids are in school 10 miles from here, and it's true here. So I think part of what we need to interrogate with education, and I don't see that much going on, maybe I'm not looking hard enough, is how it reinforces the norms and then defines the boundaries of empowerment.
So I'd like to get to our last question, and then maybe we'll have time for maybe one more question. But this is on this issue. It's a great. I mean, it gets to some of what we were discussing here on kind of balancing wanting to have some uniformity and some standardization and something that we could say at a global level, but also noting the importance of culture and context. Does one person want to take a stab at that? We have time for one person to answer. Other than I could say it's complicated. No, I won't.
You're the guru on this. Go on then.
I have no global answers.
All right, so an area for future work. We'll leave it at that. Okay, so we have time for one. You've been really trying. So let me take this question back here.
Yes, thanks. Thank you so much, and a wonderful panel. Thank you for being here. My name is Teresa Casale. I'm with the International Center for Research on Women, and I'm also the manager of the newly convened Coalition for Women's Economic Empowerment and Equality, which is a group of NGOs that has coalesced specifically on the policy level around women's economic empowerment because of the specific stated interest that this US government currently has on the issue of women's economic empowerment. So to your point, Emily, in the video that you showed, which is really great, and I'd love to have a copy, when governments get involved in attempting these interventions without the proper data, obviously these interventions can be unsuccessful. So how do we bridge that divide between policy and this excellent data and research that's being done? And to that end, if you have any excellent or any policy recommendations specifically, please do let me know.
Thank you. And we can take one more, and then we'll do quick questions. Okay, Lynn Scott, yeah, were you trying? I couldn't tell if it was you or the, the woman back there. Okay, sorry.
Is that working? Yeah, okay. So I just, as somebody who actually is by trade a cultural historian, okay, you know, where you do straddle this very close-up knowledge and the big picture knowledge, I really feel compelled to point out here that we would not be in this room, none of us, if we had not acquired enough data in the last 20 years that we know something we didn't know before, and that is that gender inequality is global, it's real, it's negative, and it has a pattern you can see from space. Okay? And that we need to keep that in mind, because we will disempower ourselves if we allow ourselves to be fragmented too much in our thinking. So I just had to pitch that.
Okay, and then the lady in the back right there, yes. And then we have to close, I'm sorry.
Sorry. Hi, my name is Miriam Kerr. I'm a monitoring and evaluation specialist of Vital Voices on the Women's Economic Empowerment team. And I think we actually have some other colleagues in the room. And this is really exciting for me because there's so many people in the room right now and on the stage whose research has really informed our M&E system. So I just wanted to ask really quickly, and I can say a lot more about this, but can any of you speak a little bit more about the negative implications or the dangers of asking women or repeatedly asking and returning to the same participants about their empowerment or their self-perceptions on it, especially when you are bringing their husbands in, or you are closing that feedback loop of taking those results back to them and saying, hey, we've been tracking you for 5 years, and this is what you've said about your decision-making or your confidence, et cetera, et cetera. So just anything that you can share on that end would be useful. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so first question, and Linda, your point is very, very well taken. So yeah, I feel it here. But first question on bridging the policy and research divide. I mean, I think this is another, $20 million question, but any takers on that one? Sure. Marcus wants to talk. Yeah, I can.
So I think you could read Susanna's book if you're a policymaker and throw up your hands and start crying, but you shouldn't, right? Because the message that comes out of it is there's a way forward and here's some ideas, right? It's not just sort of destroying measurement as we know it, it's actually constructive. And so I think bringing these measures into the impact evaluations, the M&E systems, and I'm not going to touch your question, but bringing that into these systems is going to help us understand more of the dimensions that policy is affecting. And we can start thinking, okay, I want to increase women's earnings, or I want to increase their mobility, and so I think it's really going to help start making better policies, right? And there's lots of work going on, like more than, it's sort of golden age would be too much, but Myra has this roadmap of evidence on interventions, and so you're starting to see more and more each year that are telling us different things, and this is going to help them do a better job of telling us what those programs are doing.
And one thing that researchers can do is adopt mixed methods. I mean, that is a very, very useful suggestion. And by adopting mixed methods, you actually solve the puzzles that data sometimes throws at you. And you find that actually having focus group discussions, those kind of things really resolve and really your results start making sense then to yourself. And obviously then you can engage with policymakers at that level.
Well, and I think what Marcus said, sorry, but it's very important, is the accumulation of evidence really makes a difference. And I think that, yes, we are starting the golden age, that we have evidence to talk about. I mean, when I was at ICRW 20 years ago, whatever, we had anecdotes. You cannot do much with anecdotes. With this kind of evidence, you can do.
I think there's a challenge in the research to policy conversation, and that is policymakers want positive stories, and you cannot always give them a positive story. And sometimes women's empowerment takes forms that are not very virtuous. You know, they might leave their husbands, they might do all kinds of things. So there's a sense in which I often feel like, you know, I'd just rather be a researcher because then I can deal with unpleasant truths. Because I know that some of the messages that I want to take to policymakers, they do not want to hear, you know, because sometimes it's about intransigence and so on. Can I just go back to something that Marcus said? This business of the questions that you ask, bringing about change, I think that's a very interesting claim. We used to have people in IDS who did participation, and they would say, you know, we went to a village, we talked in a participatory way to people, etc., and they said, violence has gone down. My question would always be, can you please go back 4 years later and see if that change lasted? Because if it lasted, then you're onto a very cheap solution to make change happen. But if it was simply the feel-good factor of that moment, you know, we don't know.
Any comments on the potential negative implications of measurement over time?
I'll take that, because we've been doing some work, but I want to rephrase it in a way, because you seem to be talking about taking quantitative measures back in time. We've been doing quantitative surveys, but we've also been visiting the same group of women, 2008, 2014, 2016. But we don't say, oh, you know, you were empowered before and how is it now? We say, you know, when you spoke earlier, you said this, this, and this, you know, has anything changed? Or, you know, how do you see it? And I'm going to share a very nice little story on that one. And that is, you know, in Bangladesh, there's been a real rise of very deliberate Islamization of a very particular kind, of a, you know, Saudi kind, if you like, which treats the Bangladeshi Islam as somehow not authentic, and it needs to be purified. So there's a lot of stuff going on about people talking in ways that make them sound like good Muslims. So we went to talk to this woman once, and she said, oh, well, you know, a good Muslim woman doesn't go out, you know, she gives her money to her husband, she's very virtuous, she covers herself, she just does this, that, and the other. And we thought, oh, all right then, you know, what to do? We went back 2 years later, and she said, no, I think it's really important for women to go out, you know, it's really important. The thing about having some money of your own is a real theme amongst the research that we've done, having some money of your own. So she was talking very differently. So we said to her, well, you know, last time you said, oh, everybody should stay home. What's changed? And you know what she said? She said, my mother-in-law died. We shouldn't laugh. But
not for the dead mother-in-law.
But you know, it told you about performance. You know, she was performing the dutiful daughter-in-law for us. And there's no way we would have known that if we hadn't gone back and got a different story.
Well, with that, I think we should. I love my mother-in-law.
On that positive note.
And no, I think we should end on the note of a story disguised maybe as a joke. No, but I want to thank all of you for your contributions and for being here today. I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank and congratulate Susanna on her book and Sonia for being here to comment. And I hope we can keep this conversation going. I think there's something really rich around, and I think we need to be bridging this divide between research and policy, and how we're talking and how we're, you know, capitalizing on all of the work that we all have collectively done over many years to keep driving our points forward. So thank you so much, and thanks to CGD for hosting.